ISIS and the extermination of Christians. That's the topic of tonight's byline. Now, there are some stories emerging from the Middle East as of late, but one particular story seems to be getting glossed over by the mainstream media. What's that? I'm talking about an entire civilization that's being stomped out of the Middle East. Christians are being persecuted en masse, and the silence in the media and the West more generally is deafening. To be frank, they're either completely unaware or they don't give a damn. In Mosul, a city in northern Iraq, Christians have been given a choice to either convert to Islam or die. ISIS, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, issued a statement, a decree really, giving Christians a Saturday deadline, just this past Saturday, a deadline to convert at the sword. Here's just part of the statement. It was decided to offer Christians one of three choices. 1, convert to Islam. 2, pay a head tax for being Christian. Or, if they refuse, death. The statement goes on to say, the Prince of the Faithful Caliph Ibrahim, God glorify him, will allow them to evacuate themselves only from the borders of the state by Saturday, July 19th, 2014, noon hour. And after this date, the only thing between us and them is the sword. Tens of thousands have fled the city with nothing more than the clothes on their back. Bibles, crosses, churches bombed and burned, including this 1,800-year-old church. And perhaps most horrifying is that some of these families have actually converted to Islam to avoid losing their life and money. Look at this image. ISIS is plundering through the city and painting the letter N for Nazarene, which means Jesus of Nazareth, on the people's doors in order to alert authorities of which homes are Christian. Kind of like the yellow Star of David the Nazis labeled Jews with. Now, I know it's easy to think of the Middle East as a region of Islam. Why would Christians want to live there? Of all places, sorry, Mosul was once the heartland of Christianity. Christians have been in Iraq for over 1,800 years. Think about that. Their presence predates Islam. Christianity in the Middle East is by no means a Western imposition, and yet silence to their persecution. Consider what would happen if Christian radicals seized control of London or Paris and began the systematic murder of Muslims, destroying their mosques, burning their Quran. Do you think there'd be outrage? Of course there would be. Everyone from the Pope to Obama to Beyonce would denounce. But this has been happening in Iraq for the last decade. Since 2003, war and sectarian conflict have shrunk Iraq's Christian population from 400,000 to 400,000 from 1.5 million. This isn't persecution, oh, my employer won't pay for my birth control type of persecution. It's ethnic cleansing. Oh, but as I showed you in my monologue yesterday, it's apparently the Jews that are committing mass genocide in Gaza. I think there's a reason these stories aren't being covered. Within the media party, Christianity is the one religion that's fair game to pick on, to beat up. Christians are being persecuted all over the world, in Nigeria, in Syria, in Egypt. Hundreds of thousands of Christians have been slaughtered or driven from the homes they've occupied for centuries. This is a huge story that most in the media aren't talking about, and frankly, it's because they don't care. Christians are not a sympathetic group to most journalists. They're the object of derision, of scorn. You know, those crazy Christians who don't believe in science, who hate gays, who believe in fairy tales and magic. I'm sure you've heard it all. Moreover, we live in a culture of moral relativism that prefers to minimize the role of Islamic extremism. Recall the story of Boko Haram in Nigeria, where just 100 days ago today, actually, over 219 girls were kidnapped. Listen to what Obama's press secretary at the time, Jay Carney, said about it.
These girls are suffering specifically and individually, but they are also suffering on behalf of a broader proposition, which is that whether you're a girl or a boy, you should have all the rights to education that can be attained in the country in which you live.
Education? No, that's not the problem. The blunt truth is those were Muslim extremist men who kidnapped Christian girls to forcibly convert them to Islam. But how often do you hear that narrative? This does not mean all Muslims are fundamentalists. Of course not. In fact, glossing over the extremism, accepting it as a norm, actually hurts moderate Muslims, who are then marginalized and ignored. Remember, Muslims kill more Muslims than any other group. The moderates are victims of fundamentalist Islam as well. Look at Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan. I could go on. Shouldn't those mainstream moderate Muslims have an obligation to speak out against this? And by extension, doesn't the West and people who value freedom of religion and democracy have an equal obligation? They do, but they won't, because that would undermine the leftist narrative of Islam always under siege by aggressive, imperialist, Judeo-Christian crusader West. It's far past time that narrative is put to rest, and that's the byline.